Starlight Keep HFY presents Fighting for Fun. Chapter 1. The iron-holed sparring grounds on Starlight Keep were a sight to behold. Gleaming stone floors reflected the banners hanging from the rafters, each emblazoned with crests from every corner of the galaxy. The air carried the faint tang of ozone from energy shields, mingling with the rich scent of polished wood and metal. Holographic knights patrolled the edges, their flickering forms radiating an aura of authority as various alien combatants practiced under their watchful gaze. The Ironhold had a storied history. It was originally built as a sanctuary for peace talks between rival species, its architectural design meant to evoke unity. Over time, it transformed into a sparring ground where the art of combat could be honed without the stakes of war. Every detail, from the intricate mosaic tiles depicting ancient battles to the ambient hum of invisible shield generators, reinforced its role as a place where skill met discipline. This was a place of discipline, tradition, and recently, chaos, thanks to humanity. The introduction of mixed martial arts, MMA, had upended the structured combat routines many aliens held sacred. To them, combat was often a ceremonial dance of precision and honor. MMA's chaotic improvisation and adaptability baffled the more rigid combatants. Murmurs of confusion and, at times, outright disdain rippled through the crowd when humans demonstrated their unorthodox methods. Yet, a growing number of curious onlookers found themselves drawn to the raw energy and practicality of human sparring. The sparring grounds were alive with activity. A Talari swordsman sparred with a Zrinka brawler, their movements as fluid and rehearsed as a ballet. Nearby, a group of Cathari warriors practiced their synchronized strikes, their metallic exoskeletons gleaming under the warm light. Yet all eyes inevitably drifted toward the center ring, where a single human prepared to showcase a combat style that defied every rule. Chapter 2. Jack Mitchell stood barefoot on the polished floor, casually stretching. His movements were deliberate and fluid, each stretch accentuating the wiry strength in his frame. He twisted at the waist, his joints cracking audibly, and shook out his hands as if shaking off invisible tension. Despite his relaxed demeanor, a sharp glint in his eyes betrayed his focus. His tan skin bore faint scars, souvenirs from countless scrapes and battles, and his tousled brown hair seemed to defy gravity as much as his grin defied seriousness.
"All right, let's make this interesting,"
he called, his voice carrying an easy confidence. Sir Arlen, a Talari combat master, observed from the sidelines with arms crossed. His posture was impeccably straight, his silver-blue skin catching the light as his tail twitched with irritation. A strict traditionalist, Sir Arlen's disdain for Jack's casual approach was written across his furrowed brow. His ceremonial robes, trimmed with gilded patterns that shimmered faintly, hinted at his rank and expertise.
"This will not end well,"
Sir Arlen muttered under his breath, his sharp vertical pupils narrowing as he studied Jack. Kyle Varan sat nervously in the stands, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. The young man's shoulders were hunched, and every so often his pen darted across the page as if trying to keep up with his racing thoughts. His light brown hair was damp from the humidity, and he shifted uncomfortably on the wooden bench, his boot tapping anxiously against the floor. He muttered under his breath, eyes darting between Jack and the looming Draven warrior who was stepping into the ring. Among the spectators were a gruff Draven warrior, his scales glinting like molten copper, and a glowing Lumaran monk whose serene posture contrasted sharply with his wide, uneasy eyes. The Draven's claws tapped rhythmically against the floor as he watched, his jaw set in anticipation, while the Lumaran shifted uncomfortably, faint pulses of light rippling across his translucent skin. Beside them, a trio of Jular, Slender beings with crystalline skin whispered among themselves, their melodic voices rising and falling like chimes in a breeze. Chapter 3. Jack's first opponent was the Draven warrior, an imposing figure towering over 8 feet tall. His scaled body rippled with corded muscle, and his tail swayed behind him like a predator's waiting to strike. The Draven rolled his shoulders, emitting a low growl that reverberated through the hall. His eyes gleamed with a competitive fire, his claws flexing in anticipation. Jack stepped forward, his bare feet whispering against the cool floor. He exhaled slowly, rolling his neck and bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. Each movement radiated confidence, his grin widening as he surveyed his opponent.
All right, big guy,
he said with a grin.
let's see what you've got.
The Draven lunged forward, his massive frame moving with surprising speed. Jack's eyes narrowed as he sidestepped fluidly, his movements precise and economical. In one swift motion, he dropped low and swept his leg out. The Draven's feet left the ground and he crashed down with a thunderous thud that rattled the floor. The impact sent a shiver through the air and gasps rippled through the crowd. Jack sprang back to his feet, brushing imaginary dust off his hands.
That's 1 point for grappling,
he said cheerfully. The Draven's golden eyes widened. He pushed himself up with a snarl.
You tripped me?
Sir Arlen huffed, his arms tightening across his chest.
That was undignified.
Kale's pen scratched furiously across the page.
Humans weaponize imbalance. Fascinating.
Jack turned to the spectators, his hands resting on his hips.
MMA is all about adaptability.
He explained.
Grappling, striking, wrestling, whatever works to get the job done.
He gestured for the Lumaran monk to join him. The Lumaran hesitated, his glowing form flickering slightly before stepping forward. Jack demonstrated the mechanics of a punch, his movements slow and deliberate. The monk's glowing fist connected lightly with Jack's palm, and he immediately recoiled, his light dimming slightly.
I dislike this greatly,
the monk said, retreating to the sidelines. Chapter 4. Sir Arlen's silver-blue skin glinted under the sparring ground's lights as he stepped into the ring. Each movement was deliberate, his steps echoing with the poise of someone who had spent decades mastering his craft. The crowd hushed, their collective gaze fixed on the Talari combat master as he reached for a ceremonial training sword hanging from his side. He gripped the hilt with a reverence that bordered on ritualistic, drawing the blunted blade in a single, fluid motion. The sword's surface gleamed faintly, its edges dulled for safety, but still exuding an undeniable aura of authority. Jack, by contrast, leaned casually against the ring's edge, rolling his shoulders like a man preparing for a friendly jog. He flashed a grin at the crowd, giving a mock salute to Kale in the stands.
Well, looks like it's showtime.
Kale groaned, burying his face in his hands.
This is gonna be catastrophic.
Arlen's eyes narrowed as he assumed his stance, feet planted with precision and tail curling behind him for balance. His sword arm rose, the blade angled slightly downward in a classic Talari dueling position.
If humans believe this chaos you call MMA is combat, then I shall educate you on the true meaning of discipline.
Jack chuckled, stepping into the ring barefoot. He bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, his fists raised in a loose, fluid guard.
All right, Sir Fancy Pants, let's dance.
The moment the match began, Arlen surged forward with a burst of speed that belied his composed demeanor. His blade arced in a calculated strike aimed at Jack's midsection. Jack's reflexes kicked in, his body twisting just enough for the blade to pass harmlessly by. The human grinned, shifting his weight onto his back foot as he countered with a swift jab toward Arlen's side. Arlen deflected the punch with a flick of his sword, his tail snapping out in a warning gesture.
Sloppy,
he muttered, his voice laced with disdain. Jack laughed, circling his opponent with light, springy steps.
And yet, you haven't landed a hit. Funny how that works.
The two combatants moved like mismatched elements in a dance. Arlen's strikes were precise and measured, each swing of his sword an exercise in perfection. Jack, on the other hand, moved unpredictably, weaving in and out of range with an almost playful energy. His feet slid effortlessly across the floor, his breathing steady even as the pace of their duel quickened. Sweat began to bead on Arlen's brow as Jack's relentless mobility forced him to adjust. The Talari's frustration showed in the tightening of his jaw and the slight hitch in his movements. Jack, ever the provocateur, seized the moment.
Nice footwork, but you're leaving your flank wide open,
Jack taunted, darting forward with a feigned jab before slipping behind Arlen's guard. The human's hands shot out, grabbing hold of Arlen's arm and leveraging the Talari's momentum against him. In a blur of motion, Jack swept Arlen off his feet, sending the combat master sprawling to the ground. The crowd erupted in a mix of gasps and laughter. Kyle's pen froze mid-sentence, his jaw dropping.
He tackled a Talari combat master. He tackled him.
Arlen lay on the ground for a moment, his tail flicking angrily as he processed what had just happened. Jack stood over him, offering a hand with a grin that could only be described as infuriatingly smug.
Need a hand, Sir Fancy Pants?
Arlen ignored the hand, pushing himself up with a dignity that bordered on defiance. He dusted off his ceremonial robes and adjusted his grip on his sword.
Again,
he said, his tone sharp and commanding. Jack's grin widened.
Oh, I was hoping you'd say that.
The second round began with Arlen adjusting his tactics, his strikes becoming more aggressive and less predictable. He feinted high before delivering a sweeping, low strike, forcing Jack to backpedal. The human stumbled slightly, his grin faltering for just a moment before he recovered, twisting his body to avoid the blade. Jack's counterattack was immediate, a flurry of punches aimed at Arlen's torso. The Talari blocked most of the blows with his sword, but one slipped through, landing squarely on his shoulder. Arlen winced, his tail lashing out instinctively. Jack jumped back just in time, laughing as he did.
Almost got me there, Your Majesty.
Jack quipped, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand.
But I gotta say, this is the most fun I've had in weeks.
The crowd was enraptured, their initial skepticism giving way to a kind of awed fascination. Even the Draven warrior, who had been watching with crossed arms, let out a low chuckle.
This, I like.
Kale, meanwhile, was scribbling furiously in his notebook.
They abandoned structure entirely. It's chaos. Organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless.
The match reached its climax when Arlen, in a final desperate attempt to regain control, lunged forward with a powerful overhead strike. Jack sidestepped at the last possible moment, his hands shooting out to grab Arlen's arm. With a deft twist, Jack used the Talari's momentum to flip him over, pinning him to the ground in a controlled grapple. Arlen struggled briefly before letting out a resigned sigh.
I yield,
he said, his voice tight with frustration. Jack released him immediately, rolling to his feet and extending a hand.
Good match, Sir Fancy Pants.
This time, Arlen accepted the hand, though his expression remained stormy.
Your methods are crude, but effective.
Jack laughed, clapping Sir Arlen on the shoulder.
Coming from you, that's high praise.
Chapter 5. Sir Arlen stood, his breathing heavy, as he adjusted his robes with the quiet dignity of someone trying to salvage a bruised ego. Around him, the gathered crowd erupted into animated discussion. Some chittered with excitement, others, like the Lumeran monk, remained aghast. Their collective attention was now firmly locked onto Jack, who radiated the kind of irreverent confidence that both charmed and infuriated in equal measure.
Humans,
Jack began, turning to address the audience with a flourish.
don't fight for honor. We fight to win.
He flashed a cheeky grin toward Sir Arlen, who merely responded with a curt snort. The crowd murmured, curious at this declaration. It was rare for combat to be seen outside the scope of honor or ceremony, at least for the species present. Jack, noticing their reaction, leaned casually against the ring's ropes and continued.
See? Sparring keeps us sharp, teaches us how to adapt under pressure. And, yeah,
He paused, shrugging nonchalantly.
sometimes it's just a great way to blow off steam.
He crouched and grabbed a water bottle from his belongings, twisting the cap off with a practiced motion. As he drank, Kyle, still furiously taking notes, glanced up.
They treat combat as both a strategic exercise and a recreational activity. Fascinating.
Nearby, the Draven warrior let out a low growl of approval.
Humans are full of surprises. I think I'd like to learn this sparring.
Jack smirked, tossing the empty bottle back into his bag.
Anytime, big guy. Just remember, I charge by the lesson.
Laughter rippled through the crowd, and even the Lumaran monk allowed a faint glow of amusement to pulse through his translucent skin. Cale, however, was less convinced. He tapped his pen against his notebook thoughtfully.
So, it's less about tradition and more about improvisation?
Jack nodded.
Exactly. If you can think on your feet, you've already won half the battle.
Epilogue. Later, at the Dragon's Rest Tavern, a medieval-themed bar aboard Starlight Keep, Jack sat nursing a drink alongside Cale and Zarkon, a burly alien with 3 eyes and a laugh that could shake windows. The bar was bustling, the chatter of dozens of species blending with the clinking of mugs and the occasional burst of laughter. Cale scribbled something in his notebook, his brow furrowed. Jack glanced over.
Let me guess. Humans, completely insane, but alarmingly effective. Close?
Cale smirked faintly.
Something like that.
Zarkon leaned in, his voice a low rumble.
I heard you tackled a Talari combat master. Bold move.
Jack grinned, taking a sip of his drink.
He had it coming. Besides, I'm a giver. Gave him a valuable lesson about humans. Never underestimate us, especially if we're having fun.
Zarkon chuckled, shaking his massive head.
Your kind, strange priorities.
Before Jack could reply, Thorin Ironstar, the grizzled dwarf engineer, stomped over. His thick boots clanked against the tavern floor as he approached, his expression tinted with amusement.
I heard you taught a Talari to wrestle.
Thorin said, crossing his arms.
Next, you'll be teaching them to box a space kraken.
The end. Thank you for listening to this audiobook. We create stories for you to enjoy here for free, so be a kind, gentle human and like and subscribe to not miss a single upload. Please consider joining the channel for exclusive content, and we hope you join us again in the next audiobook.